presentation. Everyone kind of just quieted down a little bit. So I was actually at a SAFE training, Scrum Agile training a few weeks ago with Jerry.
Don't hold that against her, okay?
And he was saying that his son is going to Laurier. I'm like, hey, sometime you should combine a visit to your son with doing a presentation here. And he was like, oh, I'll do the next one. So here he is. So he's actually preparing this presentation for the Toronto Agile Conference next week. So he's going to do a little dry run for us today.
Yeah, extremely dry.
Extremely dry.
Yeah.
Just a couple notes. I mentioned this already when not everyone was here, but the restaurant, TWH Social, has generously offered the space with no minimum spend. So please do support this business and order at least a drink, if not some food. Because we do not have a budget for this for this event. The other thing is we will be videotaping tonight. So hopefully, if anyone has any concerns about that, please let us know. Anything else? Am I forgetting anything, Lisa?
I will be moving the camera towards the room, so if you don't want to be on the video, let me know.
Mark's handsome, he wants the camera.
I should have fired my shirt, I guess.
Okay, so without further ado, I'll let Jerry go ahead.
Excellent. All right. Give me a second.
There are a few more chairs at the table. If you guys want.
Yeah, don't be scared of the guy at the front.
Pretty comfy on the wall, I gotta tell you. Cushion seating.
All right. Well, good evening. Oh, goodness, I talked to Michelle. She said, yeah, if you want to do a dry run of any presentations you're doing anything, come on out to our meet and greet. You know, there might be 6, 7, 8, maybe 10 people show up. And I'm like, okay, that sounds like a great place to try this out. And I'm like, oh my goodness, look at all the people here. Well, thank you very much for coming tonight. And thank you for having me as a host and presenting to you here. I do want to acknowledge our hosts and the ability to turn this around so fast. Like they managed to get this venue. That was amazing. That's Agile with a lowercase a. I thought that was fantastic to be able to get a facility that's accessible. So thank you very much for inviting me, as well as taking care of this. My name is Jerry Doucette. I'm an employee. I work at Vertique. You may or may not have heard of Vertique Consulting, but I actually work with Michigan. He lives in London. I live in a little small town called Kleinburg, about an hour away from here. Yeah, as Michelle said, my son's going to Laurier. And so my wife and my younger son are meeting with him right now, and they're having dinner because it's my younger son's birthday tonight. And I told him, I said I'll join them for cake afterwards. So this was a fantastic opportunity to come and meet you. I'm always interested in meeting people in the industry. As we go through the presentation, you'll learn a little bit more about me. I'm actually an introvert, almost to the extreme. I've been in the industry, and when I say the industry, I'm in the Agile domain for about 11 years now. But most people don't know me because I hide. I don't do presentations. I don't do conferences. I'm the guy sitting in the conferences watching other people do it. So this is a real step out for me. Everybody kept encouraging me, get this presentation done, do one about Kanban and Scrum because you teach both of them. And I kept saying, no, it's, I'll let other people do that. And they kept encouraging me, so I said, fine one day. And I submitted my application to TAC for my paper, and then they accepted it. And I went, oh crap, I gotta do it. So what you're going to see today is version 0.1. I've never taught this part of it before. It is a very light view, and we're gonna talk about Scrum versus Kanban. We're gonna have a comparison, quick discussion about that. But beyond that, what we're also going to do is I'm actually going to present to you a case study. It's something that I've worked with, and going to use that as an example to show you Scrum and Kanban in action. Of course, I have signed a non-disclosure agreement with the client, but I made it very clear to them that I would be allowed to present the things. So the things that you're going to see are real data pulled from their system. I'm not allowed to tell you who they are, but it doesn't take a rocket scientist. Just look at my LinkedIn account. You can probably figure out who it was. But I didn't tell you. I didn't disclose who it was. Any questions before we get started? No? So the title of the topic that I'm talking about tonight is, when you're talking about Scrum and Kanban, right? It's Scrum to the left, me, Kanban to the right. here I am stuck in the middle with you, which I thought was a fantastic way to sort of summarize it. And for those of you that might remember, there was a song, right? Back in '72, Steelers Wheel released a song. And I just thought, you know what? Let's actually sing it. So, welcome to karaoke night. Come on, you guys can do it. Think about the lyrics here. It ain't right. I'm so scared. Fall off my chair. But you gotta get this part right. Scrum to the left of me, Kanban to the right. Here I am, stuck in the middle with you. Which feels like my life sometimes. Stuck in the middle with you. Wondering what it is I should do. It's so hard to keep the smile on my face. A lot of coaching songs, right? Scrum to the left of me, Kanban to the right. Here I am, stuck in the middle with you. Started out with nothing and you find that you're a soul. I had to insert the woman, just be fair. And your friend they all come promise, tap me around the back and say, please. It sounds like a product owner. Please. Just the words resonated with me when I was coming up with this idea. To be honest with you, it just came on the radio while I was thinking about it. You know, but I can see it makes no sense at all. If you would go to sleep on the floor, then I don't think that I can take it anymore. Scrum to the left of me, Kanban to the right. Here I am, stuck in the middle with you. We get you warmed up. I think you've never done this to your brain. Nice interludes. We can talk about the mechanics tonight. So, I do like the venue. By the way, the food was fantastic. I don't know whether any of you ordered meals, but it was really good. I had dinner before we started. Started out with nothing, and you found yourself again. And you put me on the floor, and you slap me on the back and say, please, please. Well, I have absolutely no right to use this song. I didn't get approval for it. I'm putting the lyrics up. I'm sure I'm breaking about a half a dozen copyright laws right now. But you're not going to tell anybody, right? Hopefully no one's recording. Of course, this will go out on YouTube, and I'll get a call tomorrow.
I don't think Jerry Rappert is anywhere with us anymore.
I promise there won't be any more singing after this. All right. I'm going to kill that because you don't want to listen to any more music. Scrum and Kanban, or Scrum versus Kanban. There seems to be a lot of discussion lately about these things. A lot of organizations adopted Scrum years ago. I'm sure a lot of you have dealt with this, trying to use Scrum in various forms or incarnations. Have some successes, some failures, some challenges in that. That's really what we're here to talk about tonight. So really what we're going to do is I'm going to spend a couple of minutes talking to you about what is Scrum. When we talk about Scrum, what is that? And what is it to you? And what does it say in the Scrum Guide? I'd also like to spend a couple of minutes just talking about what is Kanban. We hear about this thing Kanban. There seems to be different understandings about what Kanban is. Is it just a board? Is it more? And what does that mean for us? I want to talk about that so that we can have a comparison and contrast about Scrum and Kanban. And then, as I said, we're going to do a case study. I'm going to walk you through an actual case study with real data from a client that we worked with a little while ago, and you'll see some of the things that they've done and how they managed to make these work together. Just a quick background for me, and I will not read the slide for you, just to give you an idea of where I am from. I've actually been working in the industry. We talk about the technology sector since about '91. So I spent about 28 years in the industry doing various things. I coded in those wonderful ancient languages called Pascal, Fortran, COBOL, all of those old languages, but I found that I wasn't a very good programmer. My code was great, but I was writing way too slow. So I migrated myself into project management because I thought I would solve all the project management problems that I was experiencing. Turns out, if you become a project manager, it's now your fault, which was an interesting experience for me. I then managed to sort of work my way through the career, became actually somebody that was very interested in agile practices. My first introduction to Scrum was with a team at Picky Bows, and it was about 11 years ago, summer of 2008. We were having problems between business and IT. People were fighting with one another. They're constantly saying, you didn't give us what we wanted, right? You didn't tell us what you need. The typical argument that you get. But what was really interesting was one of the guys in the team said, I heard about this thing called Scrum, where they're supposed to come together and create a partnership. We investigated in it, and it was a fantastic experience. And I've been an avid Agilist ever since. I've maintained my PMP credential just so that I can have the balance. So don't hold that against me either, for anybody that has the PMPs. But it does help give me that balance. As I mentioned earlier tonight, I've got 2 sons. I'm very proud of them, but I am an introvert. So for me to do things like this, it takes a lot to sort of come out. I'm hoping to share with you some thoughts because I feel that I've taken a lot from the community, and this is my ability to give something back to the community as well. So let's talk about the problem. What is the problem that we see? Well, there's lots of problems taken and looked at from various aspects. But I think one of the core problems that we're seeing right now is there seems to be a confusion. People don't really understand when they hear about Scrum and they hear about Kanban. What are these things, right? We thought we knew Scrum. We tried out Scrum. It failed. Or we struggled. We challenged to make it work. Then we hear about this thing Kanban, so we built a Kanban board, and that didn't really work. So there seems to be a lot of buzz in the industry right now where we're saying, well, is it an or thing, right? Is it we adopt Scrum or we adopt Kanban? We use one of these approaches. And I'm of the opinion, because I teach both of them and I've coached both of them, that it doesn't have to be an or experience. It can be an and experience. In a lot of organizations, they can take benefit from both of these. You can get value from both of those. It's not a mutually exclusive situation. So through today, what I'd like to do is walk you through that case study and hopefully convince you that it is possible. Not that it's the preferred method, but it is one approach where you can actually have success in bringing these two together. So I'm going to ask you, I'm going to actually put this on you guys in the room. What is Scrum? When you hear the term Scrum, what does it mean to you? Anybody like to take a shot at that? And by the way, whatever happens in the room stays in the room, except for what's being recorded. Right? So, but they're not going to see you on the camera, so don't worry about that. But if I was to ask you, what is the elevator pitch for Scrum? What would you say it is? An elevator pitch for Scrum. Anyone want to give it a shot?
Scrum is a complex framework that utilizes change for a competitive advantage.
Very nice. Yeah, do you see that? Right. Anything else when you think about Scrum? What else is Scrum? Yes.
An embodiment of the Agile Manifesto.
Yeah. All right. Any others? When you think about Scrum, what comes to mind? What is the elevator pitch? So what would Scrum mean to you?
It's a lightweight, incomplete process framework.
A lightweight, incomplete process and framework. Excellent. Any other thoughts?
Think about teams.
Teams. Excellent.
With very structured Scrum methodologies or ceremonies. There is Scrum, there is stand-up, sprint review, sprint demo, all those sorts of things that belong to Scrum.
Excellent. Yeah, I think you guys have really encapsulated it. I think we've done enough in the industry and we've had enough conversations. We've read the Scrum Guide. Because the Scrum Guide is very specific, right? It does talk about teams. It talks about collaboration. It talks about these things. When we talk about Scrum, right, it's very explicit when we talk about these things to the various people that are involved. I've had conversations with Ken Schwaber and with Jeff Sutherland. Scrum is not a project management methodology. It's not meant to replace project management. It does use empiricism. It's an inspect and adapt. It pulls from the Agile Manifesto, and it talks about continuous improvement. There's a lot of the embodiment when we talk about Scrum and those sorts of things. Scrum has values. It has practices. It has artifacts and events. The Scrum Guide is very specific about what it wants in these things. So I won't say it's prescriptive, but it is very specific as to how these things work together. There are roles in Scrum. They are team-based roles, right? We've got a Scrum Master, a product owner, and then you've got your team members. So it is very specific and very clear in the Scrum Guide about what this is. And it definitely is for complex product developments. There are a lot of organizations, a lot of people that have adopted it for different purposes. There are other people using it for process development, for those sorts of things. But it was primarily and originally built for software development. That doesn't mean it can't be used elsewhere, but that was its original intent. It definitely focuses on teamwork, on collaboration, and when we talk about this, and you read the Scrum Guide a little bit further about the team, it says that the team is actually supposed to be independent. It talks about cross-functional teams having all the competencies, right? This is language right from the Scrum Guide. It talks about them having all the competencies needed to accomplish the work without depending on others that are not part of that team. This is what the Scrum Guide gives us as guidance as to how we're supposed to work together. To help us deal with the complex and the rather messy work environments that we work in, though, we've tried to adopt other techniques that sort of layer and use and leverage Scrum. That's where these scaling approaches come from, right? This is where Scrum at Scale and Nexus. This is where Disciplined Agile and Safe. These are why these have come up, is to try and deal with the complicated work environments that we work in. But Scrum is very clear. It talks about the roles, the events, and the artifacts, and it says in the notes section in the back that they're actually immutable, and that no part of Scrum should exist without the other. It only exists in its entirety. You can certainly use the practices of Scrum, not in their entirety. You can borrow parts from that, but the result is not Scrum, and it shouldn't be called Scrum. So it's very clear about this. It's a very disciplined approach. It's very simple, very clear, but it's very difficult to master sometimes, partly because of the people that you're dealing with. Make sense? Excellent. So when we talk about Kanban then, we're going to take a look at Kanban in a similar light. Does anybody want to take a stab? What is Kanban to you? If you were to give an elevator pitch for Kanban, what would that be? Yes.
Flow management?
Excellent. Very good. Flow management. Anyone else?
Whiteboard with stickers?
A whiteboard with stickers. Yeah, that's a good summary. Yes. Excellent. Any others?
A process that reminds you to stop starting and start finishing.
Yes. Excellent. The stop, starting, start, finishing. Any other thoughts when you think about Kanban? What do you think of?
Limit work in progress.
Limiting your work in progress. Yes.
It's a set of methods to enable continuous improvement.
Yes. It is a series of methods and practices, specifically under the Kanban method, that allows you to enable improvement, continuous improvement, that improvement cycle. When you look at Kanban, and you look at it through the lens of trying to adopt it, it is actually called the Kanban method, whereas Scrum is a framework. So it's interesting to do a compare and contrast, because we're talking about many people saying, well, is it one or the other? Well, if we're going to use the same, what are the similarities and differences? Well, Kanban actually officially declares they are not a project management methodology either. So there's a comparison. They're very similar to Scrum in that context. They also use empiricism. When we talk about Kanban, Kanban is based on empiricism, on empirical assessments. Kanban also has principles. They have their own values. They have their own cadences, which essentially are the equivalent of events or meetings, which we have in Scrum. Kanban also have roles. Now the roles in Kanban, though, are a little different. The roles happen at the system level, not at the individual team level. So there is a slight difference there. And there is no formal Kanban process that you follow, like Scrum, which has a very well understood process that people follow. Kanban primarily is for service delivery, but it doesn't mean it can't be used for other things. A lot of organizations take a service delivery mindset towards providing products and services that they deliver. So they can use Kanban for solving business problems of various types. As long as the customer has a need and you do a series of activities and then deliver on that solution, that is Kanban. You're providing a service to them. The one key difference with Kanban, though, is that Kanban focuses on the work and it focuses on the system. It doesn't place as much focus on the people. Now, the people do the work, but the focus is always on looking at the system and looking at the work and how do we fix the system to create a more humane environment for us to work in. Kanban is meant, and it works well at the team level. We talk about team Kanban. It also can be used at the system level across the entire organization. And it certainly is meant for that. That means that we can use it for portfolio and program management. And we see a lot of organizations using Kanban and having Kanban boards either for managing portfolios or for programs, because it's a great tool for providing you with that visibility and giving you that view down on what's happening. It allows you to map or visualize the end-to-end system. And if you're getting into more sophisticated, more mature Kanban systems, that's actually where you want to go. Not just look at the teams, but also look at the interdependencies between the teams. So it almost is looking at that ecosystem of interdependent services where we take things from concept to cash. So there is a slight difference between Kanban and Scrum, but there's a lot of overlap too. And Kanban, because it starts talking about working between teams, it actually is a scaling tool unto itself. It allows you to work and look at the connections, the interconnections between the organizations. Kanban actually also has change management principles. Not everybody's aware of this, but I just want to point out that Kanban says a couple of key things. It says when it comes to change management, you start with what you've got. You don't change anything at all. Inspect, take a look at what you have, find out where those key pain points are, those frustrations, then get agreement to pursue evolutionary change and incrementally evolve your system. And then from that, we encourage active leadership to help us actually move the change forward. It provides many levels of maturity as well. There's actually the Kanban maturity model, which has been rolled out within the last year or so, where they actually talk about organizations being at different levels of maturity. So it's not immutable in the sense that as long as you're applying some of the Kanban practices, you may be at a very low level of maturity, but that's okay. You can actually progress through, and it gives you sort of ideas as to how to move from one step to the next. That make sense? Excellent. So when we talk about this, do they have to be mutually exclusive? Is there some common ground that we can provide? Is a coexistence possible? And I argue yes. I think that there is a possibility to be able to use both in the right context. We can do that. Each provides relative value, but there is an opportunity to do this. And to help with this, I'm going to walk you through a case study now. This case study is going to provide you with some background and information. And as I said, this is based on a real team that I worked with in an organization. They were a fraud governance or an anti-fraud team in a large multinational organization in Canada. Like I said, if you look in LinkedIn, you probably figure out who it is. It's not that much of a surprise, but I'm not going to openly tell you. Their mandate, they're really to help reduce risk. That's their real job, is they take a look at the fraud opportunities and the things that people are taking advantage of, and they're trying to buckle that down and really manage the risk in organizations, and to really help their stakeholders, partners, and customers in managing that risk as well. They're really a shared service for the organization, and they do a lot of various things. They perform risk assessments, they provide feedback and advice internally to their staff, to their stakeholders, and they try to come up with strategies for dealing with this, including they lead a lot of development of maybe back-end software implementations and processes that go out to the branches to help deal with combat fraud as well. So they are not about doing fraud investigations, that's a different department, but they're about helping to find how do we manage risk in the organization. So they really have authority over the tools and the practices and that across most of the enterprise. So that's where it begins. Prior to 2013, this group is using waterfall and gated types approaches. They were having fair amounts of success, and they had some pretty good things that were going on, but they were having some problems. A lot of the complaints that they were getting, both internally and externally, was that they felt very siloed. There was a lot of disconnect between the people and the work. They had a lot of different customers coming in from various aspects within the organization, and they weren't necessarily even talking to one another. They were considered almost an isolated group in providing shared services to them. There was very slow response time as well. People would come and ask them to help, and then it would take them a long time to respond. So a lot of the complaints they were getting sort of echoed that as well. One of the key reasons they figured we need to do something different in 2013 was because there was a rapid increase in the types and the severities of fraud that was happening out there in the industries. It's not necessarily that, that there was just more of it, but there were more varieties. So they needed to find better strategies for dealing with these new frauds, these new fraud types that were happening out there. So they really needed to be agile. And this is what brought them onto this path. Having a conversation with me was how do we use agile techniques to help us manage risk in our organization and start deal with these things in a more timely manner. So interestingly, prior to them engaging me, they had been mandated by their executives and by their leadership that they are going to use Scrum. You guys have never seen that before, where somebody in leadership tells them the approach they're going to use, right? Yeah, these guys were told you will use Scrum, which I thought was a really interesting approach. Was here's your solution. Now go ahead and figure out how it actually works. So when I actually came into the group, this was basically what was presented to me. Was help this group use Scrum. And we don't want to talk about all their alternatives or different techniques. Scrum is the answer for us. So it was an interesting approach to take with them. So over a course of probably about 3 to 6 months, I worked with the team, I taught them, I coached them, we helped them implement Scrum practices, and we did see some really good benefits, right? We did actually see some real improvements in the team, and we got some really great feedback from the customers internally. The team was definitely saying that there was more transparency, more visibility. The customers internal to the bank were also saying the same thing. They felt they were more in touch. They could see what was going on. There was a better feeling on the team, too. The team felt more empowered, more involved in what was happening. They felt that they were more in touch with what was going on. They definitely felt more collaborative. So it definitely did solve problems. Scrum, right, was helping them improve. So it was a great framework for helping them improve their methods and helping them expose problems that they were experiencing in the organization and then tackle those problems as they were going along. So it was a fantastic experience. Unfortunately, after about 2 years or so, what they found was they hit a plateau. They had done a lot of things. They had managed to improve a lot of things. Scrum had given them an opportunity to improve. So it's not that Scrum was failing now, but Scrum was now exposing other problems in the organization that Scrum itself couldn't necessarily address. These are problems typically outside of the team, either upstream or downstream, or with connections, with the interdependencies with other teams. This is where we start talking about scale. And I'm willing to bet every one of you have experienced something like this in the teams that you've worked with, where you see the problems, where the team itself does very well, but as soon as they start working with other teams, there's pushback, there's resistance from the other groups, the organization and the culture from the organization as well. And that's pretty much what they were experiencing. What happened was, I had not been engaged with the group for about 2, 3, 4 years. So they continued along this path, sort of bumping along, and I got a phone call one day from one of the team members who I had been coaching prior to. Since I had left and gone on, she had been promoted. She was now responsible for the delivery. She is now their new product owner. She had been put in charge and responsible for this product that they were now helping develop, because they were using product owners, and it was actually a suite of services and products that they were actually providing as well. And she said, I need some help. My Scrum team seems to be suffering. It worked great. We're not saying Scrum doesn't work, but there has to be more. because we're struggling right now. Is there something else we can do? So I came in and I had a conversation with her. We talked about some of the pain points and struggles and problems that she was experiencing. And one of the things I said to her was, well, you know, there are scaling options out there. There are scaling techniques, there's Scrum and Scale, there's Nexus, Disciplined Agile, Safe. There's just setting up a conversation and having more conversation across your teams, reaching out and coaching those teams that you work with. These are all options. One of the options I mentioned to her was Kanban. I said, Kanban's a great tool for helping solve problems as well. So she looked at Kanban, considered it, and she decided, you know, given the circumstances and everything that's going on right now in the organization, let's try and Kanbanize Scrum. That's actually a term. So the idea here is let's not abandon Scrum. Scrum's given us fantastic results. Maybe there's an opportunity to improve the system that supports us in using Scrum. And that's really where it came from. So from an assessment standpoint, one of the things I said to her was, I can help you with that.
Why the product owners instead of the Scrum Master?
Why the product owner? That's what she was promoted to. And the Scrum Master was fairly new at the team. At this point, they had had Scrum Master join them for about 3 months. The product owner, knew about the product, and she'd been working in the domain for about 7 or 8 years. The Scrum Master had only been with him a couple of months and was still trying to get a lay of the land, and they were a fairly junior Scrum Master, so they weren't in a position to actually help make any meaningful change. I think if they had been a more seasoned Scrum Master, they may have taken action, but this was actually somebody that I had a personal relationship with, a professional relationship with, so the product owner took a lead and reached out for help. That's what. Make sense? Yeah. So one of the things I said to them was, okay, if we're going to try Kanban, if we're going to Kanbanize your system, let's take a look at that. Because Kanban has a couple of prescriptive practices as to how to do that. One of them, you may have heard of, it's called static, right? Static is an approach. I thought that was an appropriate picture for this. Static is an approach that you use, and it's a repeatable, humane process for helping an organization Kanbanize their system. And static basically stands for a systems thinking approach to introducing or implementing Kanban. Depends on who you talk to as to what the I means. The idea here is we follow a series of steps. It's iterative in nature, and we continually look at the system and try to improve the system. So we're not pulling out Scrum. We leave the team as it is. And that's one of the first change management principles of Kanban, is that you don't change anything. You go in and analyze and look at the system and see what's happening in the system and see whether there's ways to improve the system. So it's a rather interesting approach. So the conversations we had started with the internal dissatisfactions. What's happening with the team? Where are the frustrations? Where are the pain points that the team members themselves are experiencing? And to summarize, really, it was about overburdening. That was one of the key things the team kept saying over and over again. We get a lot of stuff thrown at us from various people. It's not really organized at all. We've got a lot of different stakeholders. The product owner seems to be doing her best. She's new in her role, but there isn't any commonality. We've got a bunch of stakeholders that are just throwing things over the wall. There's some repeat. We feel that there's a lot of opportunity upstream from us to actually organize the thoughts. But instead, everything's just getting thrown over the wall to us. We have to spend a lot of time manually sifting through this stuff before we can actually start building things meaningful. Meanwhile, because we're dealing with risk, we're expected to turn things around in a very timely manner. The expectation of our customer is that we give things back very quickly, because risk and fraud in a bank is seen as very bad. It's a huge threat to them. So they felt that there was an opportunity for stakeholder management and being able to manage the expectations. The replanning that was happening was really frustrating them. That productivity, they're constantly being overburdened. Maybe you guys recognize some of these things. You probably have seen them in the organizations either you've been at or that you work at right now. One of the other complaints, and this was a really interesting one when I talked to the team, was they said that they felt that the sprints were an artificial time box. And they had been using Scrum for years now, so most teams get over that feeling after the first couple of months, and they see the value of incremental delivery and fast feedback, and that's the beauty of Scrum. And yet in this case, what they were saying was, yes, we understand that, but in the cases where we have urgent things that need to be delivered, and the work only takes us 1 or 2 days, we feel like the sprints are an artificial time box that's holding us back. And our customers are reflecting that as well. So maybe there's an opportunity for improvement. So they were trying to honor the rules of Scrum, where they would commit to something, and then 2 weeks later deliver the solution. So maybe there's an opportunity for improvement. There had been a lot of talk about it, but they hadn't actually done anything about it. They felt also that there was a lot happening upstream, where they were getting asked what they felt like for the same thing over and over and over again, but from different groups at the bank. Because their fraud detection and risk management, this makes sense, depending on whether you're talking about local, or you're talking about international trade, or whether you're talking about the different groups within the bank. They're all experiencing similar types of things, and they felt with a little bit of organization upstream, it would help them manage their work a little bit better. And actually, that was identified eventually as we went through static and sort of helped them identify the problems, that was the key thing that needed to be resolved. If we could solve that one problem, or at least help relieve the overburdening on the team, this was one of the key things that would really help them go forward. When we talk about some of the things that their customers were saying about them, it became very typical and not surprising at all. When you think about fraud and risk management for the bank, well, certainly one of the things the customers were saying was they were losing confidence. They were losing confidence in the team. They were losing in the really big stakeholders, the wealth management customers, that were, people that have in excess of, say, $100 million invested in the bank. They are exposed to these sorts of things. And they were starting to lose. Some of them were starting to lose confidence in the organization because they didn't feel that they could turn around in a timely manner. And it's pretty bad when your customer keeps coming to you and saying, are you aware of this latest fraud approach? And you as a bank have to say yes, and yet really you don't. So your customers are telling you where the fraud problems are. What you want to be is you want to be in front of that. And they found that as a bank, they were always behind. They needed to get ahead. The other thing that they were complaining about was that was unpredictable delivery. It was very frustrating for them because they'd be asked for something and then they were asked, when can I have it? And we need this immediately. In some cases, ultra urgent, because this is a fraud risk and we know that it's spiking right now. And in the next 2 weeks, it could cost us, in some cases, in excess of $100 million in fraud. We're not talking about a couple of $1,000s here. So we need to be very responsive. And instead, what they found was because they were overburdened, they weren't able to respond quickly enough. So it was a very interesting situation. Stakeholders said they felt they had no personal service. There was a lack of visibility into the work and the status, which was reflected by also the team. The team themselves said, we don't really know what one another are doing. Right? I'm working on this, they're working on that. We've got our Scrum board. It's all in progress. We're not really sure what that means. We see all these things that are on progress, but we're not really helping provide additional visibility. The Scrum board has helped us, but we need more. We need more transparency as to where work's getting bottlenecked, where it's getting blocked, who's working on what type of work we're doing. We don't have any visibility into these sorts of things. They also felt that burden, right? The team knew that they weren't able to respond to emergencies. They were hearing this from their customer. This was a complaint that they kept hearing over and over again. They felt bad because they wanted to be able to respond to this faster. But they just didn't feel they had the capacity to deal with it. They were overburdened, and they were constantly trying to deal with this context switching. So a lot of these things are probably things that you've seen in organizations where you've worked. Either the stress is placed on the team is overburdened, they're not responding in a timely manner. These are a lot of the things that we see in organizations. And it was exacerbated by the fact that we're not talking about, $50,000 or $100,000. We're talking about wealth management customers who have over $100 million invested in your bank, who are threatening to go elsewhere because they don't feel that they're getting the kind of service that they need. So what we did was we sat down and we said, well, let's take a look at where your service requests are coming from inside the bank. Who's asking for these things? When we talk about fraud management, when we talk about building these processes, where are these coming from? What groups are they coming from? And what are they asking? And what types of things are they asking for? So we did an analysis. We took a look. Who are the requesters? What groups are they coming from? And we did it based on their line of business. And there were a number of large lines of business that they were collaborating with. And we just took a look. Over the last 2 years of historical data, I said, let's take a look at recent. We don't want to look at beyond that, but let's take a look at 2 years of historical data and just see who inside the bank is asking for you to help them. Because you are helping them as an anti-fraud department, right? Where are those requests coming from? We saw a couple of really interesting patterns come out of the data once we started looking at it. One of the things was a very large number of the stakeholders, so about 65% of them, were coming from just 2 lines of business. So that's one thing. Most of the requests are coming from just 2 lines of business. So that means that there's a real risk exposure and a demand for your service coming from those 2 groups. So if you can start coordinating with those groups better and manage your expectations better, you have a much better chance of success. And just those 2 were responsible for about 71% of all the requests that the team was fielding. So this is where sort of the heavyweights are. This is where the bulk of the requests are coming from. So if we can really deal with them, it might help them and it might help the team as well. One of the other things we noticed was when we took a look at the data, about 78% of the lines of business was coming from one subgroup specifically. So there's a lot of demand coming from the one group. We really need to do some more stakeholder management, and we really need to engage them more. Now the team knew this because just by experience, right? If you talk to them, they knew that these demands were coming here. But this was the first time they had actually sat down and looked at the data and said, where are they actually coming from? And this is because, and it's surprising, when you think about this, you think, well, why wouldn't they look at the data before? It's because when your head's down and you're constantly working and you're trying to deliver and you're being measured on delivery, you don't have time to step back and do these sorts of analysis. And it makes sense when we do it now, but when you're in the heat and you're actually doing it, you don't spend the time to actually do these analyses. So the way this got done was I got them to give me the data and I did it myself. I actually sat down and did it myself. And I did it for them at no cost because I figured if we can't get access to the data, it's not going to happen. And the reason I did that was pretty simple. It was because I had kept talking to them about it and they agreed, yes, we should do it. And I waited for 4 weeks and nothing happened. Right? They hadn't even extracted the data. Because they were so behind, they didn't have time to do that. And this was a thing that they weren't being allowed to do because they didn't have capacity. It only took me a few hours to churn the data. And when I showed them this, they said, well, yeah, we've sort of suspected that, but we had no idea it was to that extent. So sometimes just spending a few hours with a team and going through the data can really expose a lot. It helps reinforce your beliefs, but now we've actually got data to back up some of those suspicions. It's not just a he said, she said thing. We've actually got data to say, yes, that line of business, there's really something going on there. We need to talk to them. One other thing that we really noticed was when we talk about expedites, so these ultra urgent requests that come into the teams, it was really interesting. 40% of them, right, there were a high number of expedited work items, so almost 80% of them came from those same 2 lines of business. Now you would expect there to be on average more because they had more requests, but these are the ones that really hit the team, right? They hit them last minute, they have to park all their work, and then they have to go and do something else to help them. So these are the interruptions that are constantly happening. And you'll see in a few minutes, not only were they interruptions that were happening, but in many cases they were unnecessary interruptions because they were redundant. We were getting redundant requests from these same 2 groups. So if we could just nip this in the bud, it would help the team in dealing with things a lot. So really the data helped identify some of these things. It reinforced a lot of the things that the team had been saying, but this was the first time that we'd actually been able to sit down and look and see what's going on and do we have data to actually back this up. Of course that meant I had to go back and look at some of their tickets and I had to look at when did they start working on it, when did they finish working on it, So in Kanban, that's one of the key pieces of data that you want. You want to capture that data. If you've got an electronic system, ironically, it usually does it for you. So we usually talk about the preference for paper on the wall. And if you're using Scrum and a Scrum board, that's fantastic. I would rather have a paper wall any day, unless I deal with a distributed team. But in this case, because they'd actually been using Jira, how many use Jira? Sorry. Because they were using Jira, the timestamps were in there, so I could actually pull the data out with a minimal effort. So this is in a case where an electronic service, an electronic tool actually made it better for us. And it was really fantastic. By the way, don't ever tell Michigan I said that. Okay? You've probably heard Michigan's rant about Jira. Okay, so don't tell them I said that Jira actually was a benefit this time. When we talk about this thing, one of the other things was we looked at additional demand observations. So what else is going on with the data? And we were just looking for patterns in the data that might help explain some of the things that are going on with the team. So when we took a look at the requests, one of the things that we really noticed was about redundancies. So this team asked for, or this line of business asked for something, this line of business asked for something, but when we get it and we compare them, they look similar. So we have to go back and we have to investigate each of these. And each investigation takes time and takes a burden on the team. So what we noticed was something really interesting. 22% of the requests turned to be redundant within their own lines of business. So these are stakeholders within a line of business that aren't even talking to one another. And that's because there was no representation from the line of business. They would just pass it on, right? They would throw the requests over the wall to the fraud department. So already we're like, okay, so yeah, you feel like you're getting redundant requests. Here's the data to show it, 22%. So basically, when you think about it, 1 out of every 5 requests is something that somebody else asked for within that same line of business. So there's great opportunity right there.
Shouldn't the owner be filtering those?
What's that?
Shouldn't the owner be filtering those?
They were coming to the product owner, and that's what they felt, was the product owner would look at those and say, well, they look the same, so somebody has to research this now. So the idea is yeah, the product owner has to deal with this. Obviously, the previous product owner had been experiencing this as well. This is not something that would have just happened, because this data predates this new product owner taking over. But this substantiates the team's belief that there's a lot of demand coming in that's redundant. In addition to this, 90% of the redundant requests came from 2 lines of business. So if you take a look at that, right? 9 of the 10 redundant ones are coming from those same 2 lines of business. So again, great opportunity for stakeholder management, for educating them and helping manage that work. So this is what we call upstream Kanban now. We're looking upstream at the requests before they hit the team. Are there opportunities to help the product owner do their job so that they channel the right requests to the team? So that, you don't hit the team with all of these demand things. And even when we took a look across the enterprise, yeah, there was even a redundancy across the enterprise. There were other groups in the enterprise that were asking for things as well. So again, 13% redundant across them. And we knew, based on data, just looking at how much effort the team spent, right? Because that's the love-hate relationship about these teams that we work with in these banks and these large organizations. Everybody has to do timesheets. And usually we hate timesheets, but in this case here, we could actually go back and say, well, how much time do you guys actually spend allocated once after the fact? You say, well, that was a waste because it was a redundant request. And they said, well, about 17%. So this, again, supported their belief that, you know what, there's an opportunity to help this so that it never gets to the product owner. The product owner has some streamed things so that they can keep things focused on that team and build a nice smooth flow of inputs to the team so they can actually start working on it. So we took a look at those requests and we actually mapped them out. One of the other things you do with Kanban is you actually map it. So we did a histogram. We took a look at the number of requests and we take a look at the capability analysis that sort of comes with that. Well, it was really interesting. We actually took a look and yeah, over the 2-year period, the number of requests was outpacing the amount of work that the team could actually do. This is why their backlog kept growing, was because they couldn't finish things fast enough. So over that period, right, the demand kept going up and up and up, and it was exceeding the team's capacity to deliver. This helps substantiate also the team's feeling of that overburdening. No matter how much I do, I never feel like I get ahead. So we start exposing to that as well and taking a look and saying, well, what's going on with this group? So we said, well, there's a couple of things you could do. One of them is, well, we could try and increase the capacity or the flow, get smooth flow or increase the capacity of the team. We're not sure if that's possible, but let's take a look and see if that's possible. And the other thing is maybe we can reduce or limit the demand. So in other words, if we make sure that upstream, you're only getting the requests that really matter, focusing on what matters most, maybe that also might help you deal with the fact that the demand right now is exceeding your capacity to deliver. Because we knew that they had asked several times for additional, and yeah, I'm going to use the term resources, because that's the language they use. And they had been denied every single time. We're in cost-cutting mode at the bank. We're saving money. We can't hire new people. You have to do more with less. Work smart is what they were always told.
Go agile.
Yeah. That's exact, right? Work smarter, work faster. So what we did was we actually built a histogram, and we took a look at the service requests. And the number of days that it would take us to deliver was across the x-axis, and the count of those service requests is in the y-axis. And what we see is a really, really messy diagram. Right? There's not a lot going on here. There's a lot of noise in this, and this is all service requests. Everything that was asked for the team over that 2-year period. But it's a good start. We roughly see a distribution here. There's something going on. There's a peak here. Maybe there's something else we can dig into the data and do a little bit more. So what we did was we actually split it out. We said, let's take a look at each type of request that you get. Let's look at each service request, each work type that you get asked for. And they broke it out into high-risk issues, policy and process changes, recommendations. They're talking about exposure reports that they did, knowledge management, and then partner channels. So they said these are major categories of types of work that we do. Let's break it out. And what we noticed immediately were a couple of patterns. One, definitely a much better distribution here, and definitely one here. And on further analysis, what we even see here is you see 2 peaks sort of growing here. And we thought, is that just an anomaly or is it something else? When we actually sat down with the team, what we determined was that's actually 2 slightly different types of work, creating 2 different peaks. One we can finish faster, one takes us longer to deliver. So now we're starting to actually understand the types of demand that the team's getting and where they're coming from. And now we can start planning and building a system to help respond to them on that. A couple of interesting things that we noticed in these 2 things. We noticed that there were bumps in delivery, and you can see them. It seems to be a repeating pattern. And initially, nobody had any idea what was causing that until we mapped it and laid it over our sprint deliveries. Surprise, it matched perfectly, which makes sense because the delivery happens at the end of every single sprint. And one of the complaints they were receiving from the customers, internal, from the groups, was we have to wait so long for our answers. Well, if we see a pattern over here, there's now an explanation for those sources of variability. So maybe we can start dealing with that. We can come up with a better predictability as to how long it's going to take for these things. Because we now have real data over the last 2 years about how long it took us to build similar type solutions and get you answers. Similarly, for these knowledge management and partner channels, what they found was they found a similar type pattern. Now, it didn't match their sprints. So they were kind of wondering for a little while what was going on. But on further analysis, what they realized was it did match against their milestones because they were dealing with other teams and other customers who didn't use sprints. They didn't use Scrum. They actually had agreements with 30, 45, and 60-day milestones. So they're actually like internal contracts where they said, you have 45 days to turn this around. So this, again, was explaining the variability. So if we could take the sources of variability out, we can better predict how long it actually takes to work, maybe build a better system, a more smooth flow. So based on all the things that we talked about, they said, okay, so this is great. This gives us more data. Now we're going to want to make some changes. We don't want to break Scrum. We understand that Scrum is very specific. And we like Scrum. But maybe there's some things that we can do to help us in the system. And I said to them, great. One of the first things you should do before you change anything, set goals. Define your goals and your outcomes. What are you trying to achieve? Then define the change that you want, and then you can measure whether or not you're successful. So be very methodical in making these changes. And the number one change they wanted to do was reduce the need for pre-investigations of work. So improve the upstream management of options. Get rid of or mitigate as many of those redundant requests as they can. Make sure that their stakeholders are talking to one another. Educate them as to the practices. And this is an important process, and we'll see in a few minutes the impact that it had for that. That was certainly a key constraint. There were a bunch of other goals that they had set as well. That was the key one they wanted. They certainly wanted to provide increased visibility into the work and transparency, show us more about what's going on, show us where those bottlenecks are, what's happening with the system. Certainly, you know, if there's an opportunity to reduce the overburdening of the staff, that's definitely something we want internally to build a more predictable system so that we can work at a sustainable pace indefinitely. That was one of the key goals that they wanted to be able to do as well. And they also wanted to help their stakeholders. They wanted to increase the likelihood to recommend that their stakeholders would want to come back to them for more work. And they wanted to build that relationship with them again, the one that had been suffering for many years. So they knew there was change coming ahead. They knew they needed to change, but there were a couple of key constraints. You guys probably are very familiar with something like this. They were change weary. The organization has gone through many changes over the year, not just Scrum or Agile, but you know, the latest incarnation of this or that. A lot of people were very tired of talking about change. They said, that's all we ever do is we change. We're tired of change. Can we stop changing? And I said, okay, so we have to change you in order to build a better system, but you don't want to change. This is a challenge that we need to manage within the organization. They also had financial restrictions. I had mentioned the fact that the bank is cutting funding, reducing costs, moving people around. So they had to deal with that. They couldn't ask for extra people. And in some contexts, they felt they were probably going to start suffering from layoffs. They knew that this was coming. They were going to lose headcount, is the term that they use, not gain headcount, which is what they felt they needed. And they also knew that they weren't able to invoke policies outside of their group. They could ask to work with other groups, but that doesn't mean necessarily that they would get approval from these other groups. So they felt all of these changes really meant that what we needed to do was adapt more of a Kanban evolutionary approach. Let's try one thing at a time, as opposed to widespread change. Rolling out a whole new framework or a scaling approach that wouldn't go over very well. They felt that there would be a real knee-jerk reaction to this. And that's another reason why they felt Kanban was the best way to go. Let's stick with Scrum, and let's see whether we can Kanbanize this to help us improve our opportunities for delivery. Well, when we took a look at Upstream, there's a number of changes that they made. One of them was, they met with their enterprise, what they did was they formed an enterprise risk management committee. So get the stakeholders talking upstream and have the product owner work with them specifically so that they can have a better understanding about talking about what gets into that product backlog before it ever gets into the team. So to help all those lines of business align. What they did also was they made sure that the director of the group was part of that. So they became what they called a chief product owner to coordinate all of those lines of business. And again, when you think about it, you say, well, why didn't they do that years ago? Again, nobody had actually sat down and looked at the system. Nobody had figured out what's going on. The way that the organization had been set up was they were a service delivery group and they were just throwing stuff over the wall. This is the first time anybody had actually sat down to try and organize the work upstream, have the business partners talk to one another. Because up until then, they all had their own agendas, they all had their own things that they were being measured on, and they weren't necessarily related. So this was a really interesting approach. So they invoked policy for that. They asked each of those lines of business to appoint a key stakeholder so they could mitigate these redundant requests. Each line of business, have somebody come to this group so that we can talk about it. Bring your key things. And as part of that group, the group managed to get agreement with the director, their chief product owner. We will always focus on the top 10 things. We're not going to throw 300 things at you at once. We're going to focus on what matters most right now for the bank. Because we know we can't deal with any more than 10. We've shown that based on our throughput. So don't give us 15. Tell us what are the most important things right now. Stop starting, start finishing. This was a key agreement. It took a little bit of negotiation, but they got them to agree to at least say, you know what, a lot of your requests are redundant. We can consolidate those. It doesn't mean that we won't do it. It means that yours is the same as yours, is the same as yours. We're going to make it one request because it's the same fraud risk. So let's try to solve that one problem for all three of you. At the team level, there were a bunch of changes that they made as well to help with transparency and working together. The team actually sat down and agreed to define their own goals. This was a really interesting discussion. The team hadn't had a meeting to talk about team norms and team goals since they had launched in Scrum back in 2014, right? They had transformed in 13, they had done a team norms discussion and update in 2014, but nobody had been there. They hadn't had a coach. Their Scrum Master prior hadn't done any of this for them. They were just going through the motions. They hadn't actually done that. So they talked about this, and I said to them, what's the most important thing for you? And they said, we want to work at an indefinite pace. I don't want to feel like I'm constantly overburdened. So let's try to build a system that's predictable, that has smoother flow, where I can feel when I show up to work, I'm not going to have a bunch of stuff constantly thrown in there. That was their goal. Let's find a way to manage our work so that we feel better when we show up to work. They also, over the course of several months, I should point out, they didn't make all these changes at once. It was one at a time. Over probably about 5.5 months, they iteratively improved and changed their Scrum board. Here's a couple of the things that they did. One, they took a look at the in progress column. And they actually expanded it out to show multiple in progress activities. So in other words, they defined what their workflow is. They Kanbanized the Scrum board, turned it into a Kanban board with workflow items. That provided them with a better understanding about who was doing what and where the stage of the work was, as opposed to in progress. The other thing they did was they said, based on the work types, let's define swim lanes. So each of those work types that we talked about earlier was given a separate swim lane, just for visibility, right? And when we talk about Kanban, that's one of the Kanban practices, is to visualize your work. So they're now visualizing the different work types based on swim lanes as well. Eventually, as they progressed through, what they started doing was they actually started modeling different workflows on that board. So different work is managed slightly differently, depending on what it is. The big types of work they were talking about was if they're doing policy work or defining new policies, it's not the same as if they're building a tool, like a software tool. So why use the same process? So they actually modeled different workflows so they could show the stages that these are at. And this was to help the team as much as it was to help the stakeholders too, in better understanding the work that they were doing. They also agreed to define personal WIP limits. And the way they did this was each team member was given a certain number of avatars. And if you use all your avatars by putting it on the board and the cards, then you can't take any more work. So now they're imposing personal WIP limits and they're defining, how we're going to work together. They kept daily scrums. They found those useful. But what they did was they changed the discussion in those daily scrums. They were still answering the 3 questions. They've been doing so for years, and they found that it wasn't very helpful. And instead, what they started doing was they started walking the board from right to left, looking at the work from the end and working their way back towards the beginning, talking about the blockers, talking about the challenges and those sorts of things. So no longer did each individual iterate what they were talking about or working on. They walked the work. So the focus is on the work, not on the people. They kept the retrospectives. They felt those were fantastic, but they included context in that discussion, not just about how do we feel as a team, how do we get better, but also in their retrospectives. How do we improve the work, the workflow, and the system that we're working with? What are some things we can start doing outside of our team to help improve as well? And they kept the cadence. But one of the key things that they did was they expedited work. They said we're not stuck with our cadence of just 2 weeks. If it's high-risk work, if it's a risky thing for fraud, we will not wait till the end of the sprint to deliver it. We will actually deliver it early to the customer and give it to them and get their feedback. We're not going to wait until the end of the sprint. A couple of key successes. Yeah. I think the big one they achieved was this. 42 extra person hours per week in capacity. Just by eliminating the redundant work about researching all those requests that are coming in that are at the same time. So already you've freed up a huge amount of effort for that. And there were a bunch of other things as well. Certainly increased visibility. The team felt that they were started finishing because they were allowed to focus by having that limited width. They felt there was a reduced overburdening of staff. Interestingly, there's no hard metric to prove this. So I challenged them. I said, okay, so find a better way to measure this. It's a very subjective thing. I mean, it's great that you feel better, but let's see whether we can actually find metrics. So this is something that they're going to continue to do. And the fact that they define policies for accepting that work. So they're now explicitly defining, we will accept the work if it looks at this type, or if it's been researched, or if you've had those conversations, or if we know that the chief product owner has vetted that before it gets to our team. One of the key things that resulted from this was an increase in customer satisfaction. So the team actually felt that they were making headway. It's not just that we feel better, but actually they were up 6 basis points, and the stakeholder satisfaction ratings went way up. Stakeholders felt that they were being listened to, that they were able to respond to change, they were getting things in a timely manner. They actually felt that there had been marked improvements. And notice, the team haven't abandoned Scrum. They've just adapted their system around Scrum. They've got a bunch of things they want to do as they proceed through. I mentioned earlier that Kanban has a maturity level model that they sort of map themselves through. Basically goes from 0 up to about 7 levels. So on a rough approximation, the team is starting to show signs of, a maturity level of 2. So there's some things they want to do to really move them up beyond that. One of them, they want to define explicit whips on the current unbounded queue. So in other words, upstream, there's a whole bunch of requests that come in. And they said, yeah, we're asking for the top 10, but that doesn't mean you only have 10. There could be 12, there could be 15. We want to set explicit policy on that. But we're not going to do that now, because that could be a dramatic impact to you. We want to show you how the system works. But that's one of the things they want to eventually impose. Because once you can start restricting that, you can start measuring throughput and cycle time from end to end. And now we can build a really nice, smooth system throughout and make it predictable for everyone. So now the customer asks for something to the time they get it. We can actually start modeling and measuring that. They wanted to get better at predictability. They wanted to set more explicit policies about what work gets accepted and how. Not that they want to reject work, but they want to be clear on what the expectations are for that. And the other thing you want to do, and this was beautiful, this actually is something that they had originally wanted to do way back in 2013 and they had forgotten. They actually wanted to re-engage other connected groups, legal, compliance, operations. They said, yeah, you know what, we always wanted to do that, we didn't have time. We'd love to go back and do this because we know that that could really increase help for our end customers as well, plus make our lives better too. So they re-adopted this and said, yeah, that's another goal that we would like to get back to. So in conclusion, when you look at this, They didn't abandon Scrum. They actually Kanbanized Scrum, and they were very successful at it. So my conclusion is that Kanban and Scrum can work really well together in the right contexts. It doesn't mean that Scrum is the right answer for everybody. It doesn't mean that Kanban is the right answer for everybody. You have to look at each individual case. But in this case, they didn't have to abandon the process. They didn't have to abandon the framework, and they were able to use Kanban to help improve the environment for them. And it meant that they could do so by making incremental changes in the organization and in their system, which helped them and which helped their customers. I hope this has been helpful. I'm hoping that it has resonated with you. It probably is a story that is similar to a lot of your experiences, and that's one of the things I would like to hear. Usually I'm the guy sitting over here listening to the guy up at the front, right? Whoever's presenting at the front. And this is my opportunity to share these things back to you. If you have any feedback for me for this presentation, for my presentation style, usually I wander a lot more, but I'm sort of corralled in the corner. But I am going to be presenting this information next week at the Toronto conference. As I said, I've never done it before, so I have no idea what to expect. But if you have any feedback for me, I'd love to hear it. Aside from that, I hope this has been helpful for you, and I hope it spawns some interesting conversations for you as well.
So I have heard about Scrum.
Scrum Band. Yes.
But I don't know
Yeah.
if I don't know if it's something similar to this.
Yeah. So how many of you are familiar with Scrum Band? Is there anybody that would describe your understanding of Scrum Band? What is it?
Are you looking at me?
Anyone at all?
Take pieces of both and put them together. I don't, as far as I know, there's no like real definition.
Yeah.
I would say it's a Kanban board that you have 2-week iterations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Any other thoughts?
So you don't actually commit anything, you just.
Every 2 weeks you replenish and deliver.
You release all that.
Yeah. Yeah, and my understanding is the same, that basically it's you pull a little bit of Scrum, a little bit of Kanban, try to mix them together, take the best pieces of each. I mean, to be honest with you, when you start adapting and changing Scrum, you really technically shouldn't call it Scrum. So Scrum Band, in those contexts, shouldn't be called Scrum. It's Scrum-like. Actually, it's more like Scrum but. We do Scrum but we don't do these things. This is about trying to take and use and keep to the regimen of Scrum, but Kanbanize the system. So it's a slightly different approach. It's not about just taking the best parts of Scrum, it's about trying to keep as much of Scrum as we can.
Would you consider what you came up with for your customer Scrum Band?
I think so. I would put it under that umbrella, that it is Scrum, it's been Kanbanized, so therefore it's a Scrum Band type approach. But it's not about just taking and cherry picking Scrum practices and Kanban practices and putting them together and coming up with a new great approach. The approach here was a different approach. It was about saying, let's try to keep Scrum, but let's make specific changes based on the feedback we got from our team and based on the feedback we got from our customers, and then measure and see whether or not those are going to improve. Because when you read the Agile Manifesto, it talks about empirical approach, and inspecting and improving and adapting. And that's the approach that we tried to take here, was don't just make wholesale changes or cherry pick, let's make targeted specific changes with the outcome of improving the system.
Would you say that you changed their system or augmented it? Like did they keep all of the Scrum practices, but you added Kanban concepts and practices, or did you actually change Scrum?
The replenishment stayed. The one key thing they did change, though, and I will say this is an explicit change, is no longer were they going to wait and deliver it every 2 weeks. right? What they said was for urgent items or for small items, we're not gonna wait till the end, like every other Wednesday to deliver. We'll give it to them now. So in the strictest sense, they weren't following Scrum where they were waiting every 2 weeks. So yeah, they did change the system in that context. But that was directly in response to the customer saying, we don't wanna have to wait 2 weeks to get our stuff. There's a big risk now, and every day that we wait, we lose $1 million. So let's change now. So yeah, they did change it then.
Sorry, can I just piggyback on the top of that
Yeah.
question? Why did they feel it was required for them to stick with 2 weeks?
Doing Scrum.
Preference? Preference?
Okay.
There was apparently there was a real resistance back in 2016. They had talked about switching to 1 week sprints. Matter of fact, that was based on advice that I had given them years earlier as a coach when I tried to get them to go to 1 week, and they were like, oh no, we can't do 2 weeks, maybe in the future. And they had discussed it again 2015, 2016, and they felt, no, it's not something we want to do. Which as a coach, usually when I say when you're having problems delivering, the first thing you want to do is reduce the sprint length. You learn how to do things better, faster.
Do you have any insights as to why they didn't want to go to 2 weeks beyond comfort? And I'm sorry, I know other people want to ask questions.
Not that I had discussed with them.
Okay. Cool.
I know that there was a resistance on the team level, and I know that, well, their customers would have been happy.
Yeah.
Like, their customers definitely would have been happy based on the feedback that I got when I was talking to their customers. But the team really resisted and said, yeah, 2 weeks. Otherwise, the only thing I can do, and I'm going to paraphrase, because I'm making up things based on the feedback I got them. But if I was to interpret what they said, I think the key reason why was they felt that they went to 1 week sprints, that they'd spending so much time planning and delivering, they wouldn't have any time to deliver. And they were already overburdened as it was.
Interesting. Okay. Thanks.
Yeah, but that's a perception.
And that's exactly what we observe in our organization.
Is it as
Yeah.
well?
If you do the 1 week, basically you have daily stand-up, you have the spring planning,
Yeah.
then you have the spring demo at the end of the spring, then you have the visual perspective.
Yeah.
So you basically spend probably 10% of the time doing all kinds of different ceremonies.
Yeah.
Instead of doing the real work.
Yeah. Yeah, and I would say, as I said, I haven't had that explicit conversation with them, but I get the sense, based on what they were saying, the key reason why the team resisted was they felt if we went to 1 week sprints, there's no time left to work. We're spending all our time meeting.
Oh, and also, I find with 1 week sprint, that you spend so much time breaking down the story so they can complete it in a week.
Yeah.
You waste so much time. Like 2 weeks just seems to be a good work block, that you
Yeah.
can create a story and finish it in 2 weeks.
Yeah.
Or if you get to 1 week, you're breaking stories down so small that you're spending all the time doing it. So my other question was, like a 30,000-foot view, what did you actually change in the organization to go from Scrum to sort of Kanban Scrum?
One of them was the focus. Like we really talked about, let's stop focusing on the team. We know you guys are comfortable with one another. We talked about how you guys work together. It's not that you have interpersonal relationships that are problems. You guys aren't arguing, you're not fighting, you're a good team. Let's stop focusing on the team, let's start focusing on the work. So when we look at work, that's what we really did, was we actually sat down and looked at what work are you doing, where's it coming, where are the requests coming from, who's asking for it, what are their expectations? And they had never really taken the time to do that. They're always busy focusing on how do we work together as a team, not let's look at the work, or let's look at our process, or let's look at how we manage the work. So that was one of the key changes.
So you didn't really change the process then?
No, not in any meaningful way. Now, one of the things they did, though, was they actually changed the way that they visualized the way they work on it. So on their board, rather than just having progress, for the different work types, they defined different workflows, which they knew, but they had never explicitly visualized that. And it was amazing to see them go through that, because they did the initial board, and after about 2 weeks, they looked at it and they said, yeah, you know what, we don't work that way. So they enhanced their own board, and actually they found it easier for them to now communicate with their stakeholders. That was the transparency. Andrew?
Did you over time find them starting fewer things?
Yes. Yeah. Setting their own personal whip limits was an interesting approach. And of course, I did some interesting experiments with them too, to help educate them as to the value of this. There's a lot of good games, and I did some games and some exercises to help them understand the value of it. But once they actually imposed their own personal whip limits, that's when I knew that they had been convinced. And that's when they said, yeah, you know what, this is good for us. And they actually did that. And after a while, I would say 4 weeks, they weren't even reaching their 5 whip limit. Like they had set no more than 5. And they did this. They put the avatars on board, and then they had a little waiting area for the avatars down on the board. And more often than not, when I went, everybody had an avatar sitting in the box. And I said, all right, so now we're starting to see how much we can actually work on capacity-wise, which was an interesting one.
So unbeknownst to you, there's goodies for everybody.
Yay!
Stop starting, start finishing
Yes!
buttons. Take as many as you want.
Well, thank you. Yeah.
Let me ask one more question. So in terms of Scrum and Kanban, both the frameworks is designed, based on the Agile Manifesto.
Yes.
Specifically for the software development. Does anyone have experience to adopt this in the IT operation,
Sure.
which usually traditionally using IT service management?
Yeah.
Because
I don't know.
now,
Anyone? Maybe you can repeat the question.
does anyone have any experience in IT operation? Traditionally using IT service manager, how to manage the incident, how to manage service required problem, is there any type of those teams to adopt the Agile, or what's the approach to adopt the Agile? Whether it's Kanban, or whether the Kanban, or the Scrum?
Yeah, but every team that I've worked with in IT ops, there's no cookie cutter. It's always unique to them.
Yeah.
It's like, you can't just say, oh, well, it worked this way, what's that, Shopify. It's like, I've lost track of the number of people. Let's just do what they do at Shopify. And it's like, well, you're not Shopify. You don't have Shopify's culture. It's not going to work. And they try it, and it doesn't. And it's like, big surprise. But I was going to ask, assuming that team did daily scrums, did they do them well? Or did they do them at all?
They did them. They weren't impressed with what they were getting out of it. They felt they were of value. So even after all those years, they were still doing them. Because a lot of the teams that I've worked with, if they're not doing them well, usually it's the first thing they've had.
Yeah.
And they were still doing it because they got value out of talking to one another. Because they weren't necessarily sitting in the same. Until I talked to them, I said, no, it's not about the 3 questions.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the work. And that's when I had them walk the board. And it was amazing to see the difference in their participation over the following weeks when they started walking the board. Because they kept wanting to answer their 3 questions. And then somebody on the team would say to them, no, don't do that, right? Let's talk about the work. So it's hard to break old habits.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
You mentioned that the initial adoption of Scrum was top management imposed, yeah?
Yes.
So-
Yeah, you guys have never seen that, right?
My question is, was Scrum adopted corporate-wide? I mean, I've
Yes.
seen some headlines about scaling Scrum or scaling Agile corporate-wide.
Yeah. At that time, Scrum was the only, and I'm going to use air quotes when I say this, the only approved Agile practice. If you're going to use Agile, you have to use Scrum. Now, since then, the organization has opened up considerably. But at the time, if you were going to say that you were Agile, you had to adopt their Agile approach, which was Scrum. Yeah.
So you talked about personal whip limits, and I haven't heard about personal whip limits yet. Like recently, one of our teams where I work, there's a recognition that there's a lot of work in progress, that They have a burn down cliff at the end of their sprints. When they have work left, there's a lot of work left at the end. And started talking about Woodlands. We started on their board, on their physical board. We started kind of visualizing, showing them this is how much work is in progress. Kind of leading them towards that. But how does a personal WIP limit work? Like I can see the WIP limit from the team's perspective, so that they work together to keep that WIP low. But how does it work on a personal basis?
Yeah, so what ended up happening was the team talked about, do we accept a system WIP limit? Well, that was too much. They didn't know how to deal with that. Then I asked them, well, there's different types of WIP limits. You can define a WIP limit based on the type of work. Maybe you only accept one expedite at a time. Or maybe you only accept 3 change requests at a time, or 3 reporting functions in their case at a time. And they talked about that, and they said, well, they didn't want to restrict their customers that way because they were still trying to get their customers to talk to one another. And they didn't want them to say, sorry, we can't do any more reports this month because they're already at capacity. So they felt the best approach was, if we're going to impose WIP limits, the first step is to impose them on ourselves. It's a good way to experiment and start. We're the ones that feel overburdened. So we are going to allow ourselves to work on any of the work that's currently on the board, but we're going to limit the number of things that each person can work on. And we're going to see whether or not we actually feel better as a team. The way they did it was using those avatars. They just had little avatars. Each person, oh, this was beautiful, by the way. Anybody a Lord of the Rings fan? And yeah, so they adopted Lord of the Rings. They actually changed the team's name to the Fellowship, right? Of the ring, but just the Fellowship in general. And each one of them took on a different Lord of the Rings character. And each one of them was given 5 pictures of their character on a magnet. So once they were gone, they couldn't work on any more items. That was to help them at least start to deal with their own sense of overburdening and to experiment with WIP limits without imposing those WIP limits on their customers. Now, one of the things which you may or may not have seen when I went through the last slide is they do want to start imposing stricter limits, WIP limits, upstream, now that the customers have been exposed to this and seen the value. Now that the customers, all those lines of business, have seen the increase in throughput, they're more bought into it. So they feel they can actually start imposing some stricter limits on those groups. But they're still early on in the stages where they have to consider what WIP limits are appropriate. Is it a system WIP limit? Are there individual work WIP limits?
So my own experience with this is people stop asking you what's your team working on, and what are all these guys working on? Like, why can't you serve me?
Yeah.
And if you can make that visible, that everybody in your team has 5 things they're working on, or 3 things, whatever you set their personal WIP limits to be, it suddenly becomes a much easier conversation about, yeah, I'll make.
Yeah.
I need to go, so I just want feel free to continue the discussion, but I wanted to just say thank you for coming.
Thank you.
I also just wanted to take an opportunity, if there's anyone here that's planning to go to the Toronto Agile Conference on Tuesday and is interested in carpooling, want to put your hand up? And people can connect? Nobody? Okay. Put that on.
You should run last time.
Okay. So thanks very much.
Thank you.
I'm going to go pay, and I will also let the server know. We'll probably bring in everyone else's bills.
Yeah. I'll see you next week. Any other questions?
I wanted to thank you for showing us how important it is to measure every piece of crap and use it to make decisions. Because everybody thinks they don't have time, and it is so valuable.
Yeah, well, and that's...
And I would love it if there was some way we could just like make everyone understand that.
And you can see that's exactly what this team's problem was. They knew it was important,
They had
but we're
a
too
sense
busy.
of it, but they couldn't prove it, and now they have data and video.
Oh yeah, you should have seen the light bulb when I brought the data in and started showing them the stuff. They're like, yeah, that's what we said. That's exactly what we said. And I said, yeah, but now you've got data to back it up, so now you can go and talk to somebody about it as opposed to them just thinking you're complaining about it. Now you can show them, this is why you guys need to talk. Yeah.
So thank you for that.
Thank you very much for having me here tonight. This is fantastic. And if there's any feedback you can give to me, I appreciate it. Please connect with me on LinkedIn if you're not already connected. I'd love to meet with everyone and just talk about your experiences too. As I said, I'm usually the guy sitting over there. It's really weird to be standing up here.